let's start with the philosophy itself. So what drew you to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy?
On the path of knowledge, as you are and everybody else in this call is, you try and find truth resonance. You're looking for truth resonance. Knowledge, not in the informational sense. Informational knowledge is one thing, but knowledge in its real meaning is, some basic existential questions, right? About who are we, what is all this about, and that kind of stuff, which is the traditional domain of philosophy, right? And then if you intersect philosophy with the spiritual pursuit and call it spiritual philosophy, then we are in the domain of the real fundamental questions. Real fundamental questions presented to us in a manner that is understandable from our own level of consciousness. That's really, so you basically bridge the ontology epistemology gap, and you basically vacillate between various levels of identity with the sense of reality, and from there knowledge becomes more intimate and closer, and the truth resonance increases, right? So based on a ringside view of 10 years of the Western world, and studying philosophy and psychology and various schools of spiritual pursuit, as well as the sciences and the transdisciplinary sciences of systems and complexity and all those things, I had come to a point that I was not getting the real answers, and not getting answers that were satisfactory enough to tell me, well, this is it. This is it, not in a definitive completion sense, but this is it in terms of a very intimate truth resonance sense. So when in 2019, when I got into this, that resonance started building. I mean, it's that coming home feeling, like you are at home and you have an intuitive and a very close sense that this was what you were being prepared for all this while. And that preparation was necessary to build certain faculties to be able to appreciate this. So it's like trying to, having a go at trinkets and imitation jewelry, and then 12 and 13 carats before you reach 24 karat gold, for you to recognize the value of the 24 karat gold. Mm-hmm. And then, so that's in an intuitive sense. If I were to intellectually explain it, it is the most comprehensive and integrated view of reality that I have ever come across, based on whatever little I have gone through. And once that feeling comes in, and then you go deeper into it, it's an ocean of joy and expansion and deepening and heightening and intimacy and depth and every possible noun or adjective that you can use, both from a knowledge perspective as well as from a vision perspective and soul intimacy perspective, all of this together.
Wow. I love the term, the most comprehensive and integrated view of reality and an ocean of joy and potential. This is amazing. So how about we start with the life of Sri Aurobindo? Who was he?
That answer we'll arrive at after a few more sessions. But in a conventional sense, if I were to describe, he was born in August 15th, 1872 in Kolkata, in Calcutta, which was called Calcutta in those days. He was born to anglicized parents who wanted their children to get the best of Western education. So at age 7, he went to England. He schooled in Manchester and London, and eventually got a scholarship at King's College, Cambridge. And he excelled in everything, and he was top. But instead of joining the Indian Civil Service, which was, as you may know, a very prestigious office under the British government, which was ruling India at that time, and which his father dreamt of, Sri Aurobindo bypassed that route. He actually deliberately didn't appear for the horse riding test and and therefore was disqualified. He returned to India in 1893 to join the state service in Baroda under the Maharaja of Baroda. India was a princely state constituency in those days with the British Raj. He got into part-time teaching in Baroda, and there his political career began indirectly through a lot of nationalistic writing in journals and newspapers. And this kind of continued till he moved in 1905, after the turn of the century, to Bengal, his home state, which also happened to be the capital of British India at that time and the kind of hotbed of the national freedom movement that was gaining momentum to challenge the British colonial rule. By this time, he had mastered and read extensively all the Western classics. He had mastered 12 languages, including Indian languages, and he had read most of the classics in their original. We understand the meaning and the difference of reading things in the original as opposed to translation, right? And then by that time, he had also, after coming back to India in Baroda, he actually went through the Indian spiritual classics as well. And by 1905, when he got into writing, he had a full comprehensive understanding of the world's leading schools of thought up till his time. In Bengal, he directly launched into his political career, which was of the very revolutionary kind, distinct from the timid approach of moderation that the current Indian political leadership were espousing, which was kind of akin to slave morality, if you can use a Western term. His approach included all forms of active and passive resistance and national education, grassroots level developmental effort for self-sufficiency, and an unconditional demand for total freedom. He called it Purna Swaraj. His powerful and by this time inflammatory writing actually ended up stirring the national soul of India. And it evoked a very fiery patriotism and dynamism across large sections of society, especially the youth. So much so that the British considered him the most dangerous person in the country. And they tried their best to pin him down on various charges, which opportunity finally came in May 1908, where he was arrested based on some bomb blast in which he was not directly informed, but they maneuvered the case in that way. And he was jailed for a year, after which the trial acquitted him and he was free. But this 1 year in prison, he had very definitive and intense spiritual experiences, which actually had begun earlier. I mean, just before his prison term, he, through an initiation process, achieved the nirvanic experience in 3 days under a guided process from a seasoned spiritual practitioner in Baroda. But his prison experiences were of a far deeper nature. He had experiences of what later he calls the cosmic consciousness. And he had direct, intimate communion with the immanent divinity in things. We have discussed Spinoza and all that in other forums. So this was a turning point in his life trajectory. And in 1910, he received instructions from above to move to Pondicherry, which he did immediately. And once he moved to Pondicherry, his life shifted from an active political crusade front to a different kind of battle. From 1910 to 1950, 40 years was a journey most people don't know much about. And he himself says that his writings, which are about 36 volumes, It's a vast ocean, as I said, 36 volumes of about 500 to 600 pages each, so about 20 to 25,000 pages. But all of this, he says, covers about 10% of the whole gamut of his experiences, because he could only put into paper that which he felt could be communicated and understood by people reading it. And in 1914, an important milestone happened. He was joined by his spiritual partner, Mirra Alfassa, a French national, who later is known as the mother, came to be known as the mother. She came in 1914, met him, and it took them one meeting to recognize each other in that sense. And then after a stint in Japan, which she had to do for certain reasons, she came back in 5-6 years, and then was in Pondicherry from 1919 to 1920 to 1973, till her time in this world. And so in that period, basically 1920 to 1950 and thereafter, they collaborated to invoke and establish a new principle in cosmic existence.
Okay,
so,
go ahead. I don't know where to begin. So how about just, what is this new principle?
Before getting into the new principle, maybe it will be a good idea to basically just try and summarize his philosophy. I mean, that itself is a daunting task.
Perfect. Let's do that. Go ahead.
So it's a daunting task, but what I thought we could do is we'll try and enumerate 4 distinct truth principles. But before that, I'll basically just we'll go through what he, in summary, he says.
Sure. Let me talk to the audience for a minute here.
Yeah.
So folks, this is enormously hard. Okay. It is firstly enormously hard to communicate a spiritual experience of one individual to another individual. Secondly, we are trying to understand the thought of Sri Aurobindo. He himself has been able to put some of it down on paper. Third is that there is a chasm between the Western context of ideas that everybody holds in the West and the Indian ideas. And what we're trying to do here is that this is an introduction to begin to see where Sri Aurobindo is coming from. So please be patient with yourself as you try to grasp. We're going to do our best to put things down, but it is an enormously difficult task. Okay, we're going to try. But please be patient with yourself. Use pen and paper to keep track of the questions that you have. Try to listen more than connect it up with the ideas that you know, because you want to hear the ideas on their own terms first. And that would be a good way to begin. This is an introductory meetup. We're just trying to do the introduction as best as we can. Please keep track of all your thoughts. We'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. All right. So with that, Neelesh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. That was a very good thing you did, and it will be very useful. What I'll try to do is, while talking about Sri Aurobindo, I will also try and we will also get a glimpse of the body of ancient Indian spiritual thought, because his foundation began there. He went beyond, but he started from that core foundation. So we will, in this conversation, we will get a glimpse of the Indian thought also. So that will help us for subsequent sessions as well. Now, as I said, his foundation is the core Vedantic teaching, and I will discuss these terms, what they mean. And one could say in a pithy manner that his work uses the method of the Vedanta to arrive at the aim of Tantra, and then go beyond both in both process and aim.
Wow.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, so what does this, to introduce people to the Vedanta literally stands for the end of the Vedas. The Vedas represented the pinnacle of ancient spiritual wisdom. And I wouldn't just call it India. The location happened to be India, but it is cosmic in its texture, in its characteristic. And the rishis happen to be in this part of the geography, but that's all there is. And the Vedic age is called the symbolic age because the larger part of society was still in an infra-rational level of development. So symbols were found to be the best way of invoking the intuitive idea of something which was beyond the symbol, right? So that is what symbolism means. What Vedanta does is, with the progress of time, translate that symbolism into mental language. And the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, which you will cover later, and these texts basically try to use the language of mental philosophy to translate the symbolism into more accessible width of appreciation for society. But even then, the Upanishads required a certain level of mental development to even begin to appreciate that. And as we know, when you try to translate a symbol into a language, you gain something, but you also lose something. Now, I will use Sri Aurobindo's words to describe the Vedanta, which I think is, far better than anybody else has done it. So,
Neelesh, let me take a minute to summarize as I understand what you said, because even if we go slowly, I think that's good, because I want people to get, this is a profound point. The point is that initially when people have always tried to talk about spiritual things, they have used metaphors. They have used symbols, metaphors of showing it is like this. And that is the mode of communication in early, and this is across many religions. And from that, the next step is to fully verbalize it, fully come up with the mental vocabulary, make it more pointing. When you're doing metaphor, you're saying it is like this, and you're trying to say it's somewhere there, and you're trying to use the correspondence between what went on in your mind and the other person's mind and these external symbols in order to do the communication. The level of communication, precision of communication, the comprehensiveness of communication increases. And the great point is that when you do that, something is gained and something is lost, and we have to keep both in mind. Go ahead, Neelesh.
So I quote Sri Aurobindo here, and I'll do this slowly. And this is something we can pause, and this sentence is fundamental to the understanding of the bulk of the Indian philosophy. So it's a very, 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 very loaded sentence. The rooted and fundamental conception of Vedanta is that there exists somewhere, could we but find it, available to experience or self-revelation, if denied to intellectual research. A single truth, capital T, comprehensive and universal, in the light of which the whole of existence would stand revealed and explained, both in its nature and its end. This universal existence, for all its multitude of objects and its diversity of faces, is one in substance and origin, and there is an unknown quantity X, or Brahman, to which it can be reduced, for from that it started, and in and by that it still exists. If you permit me, I'll repeat this once more.
Please do.
The rooted and fundamental conception of Vedanta is that there exists somewhere, could we but find it. Every phrase is pregnant with meaning. Could we but find it, available to experience and self-revelation. If denied to intellectual research, a single truth, comprehensive and universal, in the light of which the whole of existence would stand revealed and explained, both in its nature and its end. This universal existence, for all its multitude of objects and its diversity of faces, is one in substance and origin, and there is an unknown quantity X or Brahman, B-R-A-H-M-A-N, to which it can be reduced, for from that it started, and in and by that it still exists.
Wonderful. How do you think we should proceed? Do you want to just go phrase by phrase and talk about it? Because if we do nothing else but understand this sentence, that is powerful. I mean, because this is the foundation. So how would you proceed?
I know what, Shrikant, I would think that, this sentence should be left to the audience, because it will require some time. What we will do is I will build on this with Sri Aurobindo's thought, and that will bring some of this alive itself.
Wonderful.
Because because this is the foundation, and then this sentence can be an instrument of meditation to each one of us here later on, late at night or early morning, because this drips in like juice. It actually permeates your whole being. And it is better to do that in silence.
Wonderful, wonderful, and thank you, Marik.
If anybody has any questions, you can ask now. Otherwise, I'll proceed.
No, we will take questions a little bit later. I want to make sure that we cover the core, and we will cover the questions, once we have the core put down. And Maritza, thank you very much for putting it in chat, folks. The entire sentence is in the chat, so if you want, you can look at it whenever you want. Go ahead, Neelesh.
So Sri Aurobindo says that his teaching is this. He says that although united in that one truth of conscious reality or self, it's an important term called self, S-E-L-F with a capital S. It's the subjective form of the Brahman. If I were to use the Western parlance of objective and subjective, if Brahman is the objective reality, self is the subjective perception of that reality in the Brahman, in and as the Brahman. So although we are all united in that conscious reality of self, all beings such as us happen to perceive ourselves as divided by a certain separativity in and of consciousness, which is a kind of ignorance or amnesia of our real self. In the mind, life, and body instrumentation that we tend to be identified with. This separativity and ignorance is the root cause of all suffering at an individual level and disharmony at a collective level, as well as an individual level in our existence, in our experience of existence. But it is possible by a certain psychological discipline to dissolve this veil of separative ignorance and recognize or re-cognize our true self, which is where we started, right? Now, the Vedantic method entails the attainment of the poise of the self of all things. That is what Vedanta is. Veda, Vedanta, Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, everything. If you ask in one line, what do they do? It is obviously, or rather in a sense, needless to say, the recovery of the poise of the self and the operation in the poise of the self. Tantra, it will be useful to introduce this term Tantra in addition to the Vedanta, because the Tantra was a school. Various people define it in various ways, but I would say that the aim of Tantra is the enjoyment and power of the powers and movements of nature, of universal nature. So then begs the question, what is the difference between self and nature? And we'll come to that. So when we say that Sri Aurobindo uses the method of the Vedanta to arrive at the aim of Tantra, it means that it means the recovery of the poise of the self with full dominion and control over all movements of the self, which gets manifested as movements of nature in manifest reality. And we'll come back to this distinction later, because this is very central to understanding Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Now, therefore, this is a good time to enumerate and understand the 4 fundamental truth principles. This is not written in this way anywhere, but I have found it useful whenever I firstly myself try to understand Sri Aurobindo and also try to explain it to others. If I were to summarize his entire ocean, not summarize, if I were to make sense of the entire ocean of his thought, I believe these 4 truth principles provide us a kind of a foundational framework on which the rest of his thought could be appreciated. So the first truth principle we can call planes of consciousness and parts of being. What this means is that although it's one truth and one consciousness, in manifestation, it manifests in a very complex hierarchy or holarchy of planes in a vertical sense and parts in a horizontal sense. So there are, in fact, 2 systems simultaneously active in the organization of our being and the cosmos, with whom we share a microcosm-macrocosm relationship. One is a concentric system where a series of rings or sheaths with the soul at the center. And the other is a vertical system, like an ascent or an ascension and descent, like a flight of steps, which are but a series of superimposed planes with a crucial nodus of transition between one set of planes and the other. There are 7 planes in this interfused vertical planar structure, 3 of which can be called to be in the divine zone, called the upper hemisphere, and 3 in the current human operating zone in which we dwell, called the lower hemisphere. And the 7th, or the 4th in between, is a plane which bridges the 2 hemispheres. So this is the first truth principle. If you want names, the higher 3 planes are called existence, consciousness, bliss. Probably in another session, we can go into each of these, because they are worth several hours of deliberation. The lower 3 are called the mental plane, the vital plane, and the physical plane, the lower hemisphere in which we dwell. Existence, consciousness, bliss is the upper divine, spiritual, divine realm. And the mediating plane, which actually connects and sets up relations between the divine and the human, between the upper and the lower, we could say between knowledge and ignorance, between the one and the many, between the unmanifest and the manifest. There are various ways of saying. That intermediate plane is called, Sri Aurobindo calls, the supermind. So this is the first truth principle. If there are any questions, otherwise I'll proceed to the second truth principle.
No, this is very, very clear. We will go into details of it, but I think if this is beautiful Let's go through the entire 4 principles and then we will take questions.
Okay.
Go ahead, Neelesh.
The second truth principle, very important truth principle to understand, is the soul-nature relationship. In Indian parlance, it's called the Purusha Prakriti relationship. Purusha Prakriti. Very simply stated, by soul, we mean consciousness as the static witness or as static awareness. By nature, we mean the force or the power of consciousness as the dynamic manifestation. So repeat, this is very important. Soul, consciousness as the static witness. Nature is the force of consciousness, of the same consciousness, but as dynamic manifestation. In our normal ego mode of operation, the ego itself is a term which has a specific definition which we will come to later. But from whatever little we know of the ego, let's just stay with that. In our normal ego mode of operation, the soul happens to be in the sway of nature, which means that the witness is apparently lost in the movement. So a simple example is that when I suddenly find myself in a fit of anger, uncontrollable anger, there is only the anger, and there is no me, at least in that time frame, to observe my anger. Yeah, so this is relatable. Or take any violent emotion or any violent invasion of thought, any movement. By movement, it is not necessarily physical movement, any movement, right? So in Vipassana, what we are taught is the observation of this movement and the ability to step back. Those who have gone through Vipassana or any form of contemplative meditation. Now, through this process of psychological self-discipline, it is possible to reverse this relationship, which therefore means to establish the dominion of soul over nature. Simple. Normal operation, nature almost completely controls the soul. Our job in this yoga, in this process, is to reclaim and reverse this relationship and establish the dominion of soul over nature. Now, this is a simple statement, but this is a profoundly significant and detailed thing to understand. But for now, let's just understand that I am in charge of the movement, but the movement is not in charge of me. Which, in another way, we can say, instead of the world creating us, understand it in whichever way we want to, instead of the world creating us, we must create ourselves and then the world. But first ourselves and then the world. Beautiful. Now, in the upper hemisphere, the consciousness and its force are one, and they are coincident in a total unity. But in the lower hemisphere where we are, it is of extremely critical practical importance to make this soul nature distinction for the yogic journey. That is the second truth principle.
Beautiful.
The third truth principle is the relationship between 3 aspects of the divine play, called the transcendent, the universal, and the individual. Customarily, it's also referred to as God, nature, and man. The same nature which we discussed upstairs before. The transcendent is the source, the one being the alpha and the omega of everything, the Brahman. Now the Brahman, the transcendent, is also immanent in and inhabits all creation, but is yet above and beyond all creation. So people who are conversant with Western philosophy understand the distinction between pantheism and panentheism, loosely speaking, not exactly. But loosely speaking, panentheism posits a transcendent which is outside all of creation. Whereas pantheism contends that all of creation itself is the transcendent. Okay. Now, the universal is the cosmic totality. The second term in this trinity, the universal is the cosmic totality of all manifest creation, diffused in infinite space and time. It includes the visible and some of the invisible mass, but it has no organized mind or body. So what we loosely mean by the collective, but in a spiritual sense, the universal has a much bigger significance than the term collective, which we use in a mental sense. Now, the individual, which we are most familiar with, is the unit of consciousness, a microcosm of the macrocosm, and it is concentrated within limits of space and time. It is also the vehicle or locus of spiritual evolution and the bridge and instrument of divinizing nature into supernature, which is the whole objective of Sri Aurobindo's process. But we'll come to that later. But suffice it to say that a consciously realized unity of the transcendent, the universal, and individual is an essential condition for the intended fullness of the self-expressing spirit. Very important. The fourth and final principle is what we call the psychic principle. I would say that the planes of consciousness were known in various traditions in different ways. The holarchical structure, the great chain of being, the nested holarchy. Our Lovejoy has talked about it, although he borrowed it from the Vedanta, but different people have given sense to this. Soul-nature relationship, not so much, except in the witness traditions where the movements you stop identifying with, you step back. But then the dominion over nature is sometimes not clearly articulated. The transcendent, universal and universal, the Trinity, in Christianity, right? The name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And in various traditions, there are different ways of representing it. But the psychic principle is unique to Sri Aurobindo, and it is very, very specific, and it is probably the most important principle for one who wants to start this process, rather than just mentally understand it. In Sri Aurobindo's parlance, psyche has a very specific meaning. It's not just general loose term used in Western psychology. Psyche in Sri Aurobindo's parlance is the inmost center in the horizontal concentric structure mentioned earlier. It's also called the soul. The soul is the spark of the divine transcendent within the individual. The soul is a spark of the divine transcendent within the individual, but it is from outside creation. It is from outside nature, and therefore from a different dimension than the 3D reality we find ourselves in. The soul and the spark of the divine in every individual represents a unique aspect of the divine truth, which the individual is called upon to unearth, evoke, and effectuate in the world. The psychic principle is also the basis of our terrestrial existence. In this earth, in this vast universe, I now mean in an astronomical sense, the earth is a very special place where soul individuation and universalization is the means and the only means of the evolution of the collective. The collective cannot evolve on its own. As we said, it doesn't have an organized mind and body. This evolution will need to be eventually consummated on earth. This is Sri Aurobindo's. This is unique to Sri Aurobindo. It has to be eventually consummated on earth, not in some other plane, in the embodied mind life, not in some trance or some samadhi, in the waking state and not asleep. Very important. And at some point later, when we go deep into it, we can revisit the significance of each of these things. So the psychic being, it's a term, forms as a centralized structure over lifetimes of experience and is the individual essence and the locus of the spiritual evolution. Essence being distinct from form. And this essence constitutes the vehicle of continuity of the spiritual evolution across lives, while form, as we know, dissolves at the end of every particular life. So the four principles: planes and parts, the soul-nature relationship, the transcendent, the universal, and the individual, and the psychic principle.
All right. So Neelesh, this is just magnificent, because what you've done is that you've clearly laid out this principle. So what I want to do now is to make sure that people get what these principles are, and then we will proceed further. So is it okay if I take some questions, Neelesh?
Sure.
Okay. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark. What we are going to do is that we are going to go step by step. This is a very large area. Okay. So we will go through these four principles one by one. So first within the first principle, we'll look at the planes, then we'll look at the concentric circles. So first, only questions about the planes. Okay. We'll go one by one. We'll collect all the, we'll get questions on just these individual parts, so Neelesh gets a chance to explicate things fully. So in my mind, there are three categories of planes. There are the higher ones, there are the lower ones, and there are ones in the middle. The higher ones, the divine ones, existence, consciousness, and bliss, those are universal, and whereas the lower ones, the mental, physical, and I think, and material, right?
It's the mental, vital, and physical.
Vital and physical, mental, vital, and physical. Those are what we interact with at a sensory level. And there is the plane in the middle. So my question is, the thing that is really unique is the conception of the plane in the middle. What is this plane in the middle? Could you talk a little bit about that?
We can say that the plane is the middle, is the origin of manifest creation. It is the principle so for philosophically minded people, you can say it is the outlook of the absolute towards the relative. Mm-hmm. The absolute by itself needs to do nothing. It is self-sufficient and blissful. But the absolute says that let's have some fun and let's create a world of relativity so that I can play with different units of myself. There is only one being, right? But the one being, instead of remaining subsumed within himself, for the sake of the play, it's as if distributes itself into numerous divine sparks, the psychic principle, right? When he does this, he has to, by the nature of creation, move from a timeless, spaceless domain to kind of make himself enter space and time, or the realm of manifestation. The principle that makes this happen is the supermind.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Supermind is also a part of the upper hemisphere. We say middle just for the sake of an expeditious understanding, but the supermind is also a spiritual principle. It is not the lower principle. Mm-hmm. And I will just point out that when you say the upper are universal, all of these are universal. Mm-hmm. The upper are spiritual and supramental, whereas the lower are mental, vital, and the normal human. So it's also called the lower triplicity or the lower hemisphere, whereas those are called the upper hemisphere. And the supramental is subsumed within the upper hemisphere. Even though for the sake of expediency, we call it intermediating between the two zones.
So let me, I mean, the one of the phrases that you used earlier that really stuck in my mind is divinity in things. So it is divinity in things. So like we've been studying the Bible and we're talking about Jesus as being 100% God and 100% man, of the manifestation of God in real life. Is that the kind of thing that he's pointing to in the middle layer?
No. The middle layer is best understood as the zone of creation. Creation as we understand it. That's where the formless begins to transition into form.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of it in an abstract sense, the formless is completely formless. For the formless to enter form and subject itself to the rules of various planes below, each having its own operating principle, the intermediate zone can be called as the mediator of right relations.
Mm-hmm.
So like you have, so if for people in the IT world, the bus architecture, Srikant,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the people in the, so basically it is the coordinating principle, for want of a better word, to translate into mental language. It is the coordinating principle between the unmanifest and the manifest. What you mentioned about the immanent divine, divinity in all things, is the psychic principle, not the supramental.
Got it. Wonderful. So it lies in that principle. Excellent. Next up, we will go to the question about the concentric circles. Can you talk a little bit about concentric circles, and is the idea, the fourth idea of the psychic principle, is that pointing to the center of that psychic circle? Wait a minute, we have a question. Shravan, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I wanted to know was, is there a separation between the first three layers and the last three? Or the way I understand is there is the Prakriti and Purusha, they are part of the Brahma, right? And the Prakriti, the Atma or the Purusha, that is part of the Prakriti. They are not separate from the Prakriti. And so, but what you, from what I understood is that what you are saying is that the Purusha transcends or it manifests to Prakriti in this case, as per Aurobindo.
Thank you, Shravan.
No, it's a good question. Thank you for that. The way we represent the 7 planes, we mentioned that they are superimposed, they interfuse into each other. So the whole principle of immanency means Satchidananda is in matter, in life, in mind. The supermind is also in life, in mind. So the 7 planes are a way of representing it for the sake of understanding the principles. But they are, it's not that they are in splendid isolation. All these interfuse into each other. So the whole meaning of immanency, or to use a more technical term, which is called involution, we will come to that later. All these planes are involved in each other. From top, they are involved into the ones below. And from below, the whole urge is to evolve back into the top. So they are not separate. We are mentioning this separately just from the perspective of understanding the different principles. But in reality, they are not like 7 different stacks. They are all into each other. That's the first question, the first point. The second point is that you're absolutely right. Purusha and Prakriti in the divine planes are one. They are one total unity. But from our perspective, the distinction is of immense practical utility for the sake of the yoga. That's all.
Wonderful, thank you. So second, can you elaborate a little bit on the concentric circles and what stands in the center of it?
Yeah, can you share screen?
Yes, you can go ahead and share screen.
This is a simplified diagram. I think it'll be easier if we
Perfect.
this diagram. So basically you understand these three planes, right? So the mental is the, needless to say, the conceptive. This is within us as well as outside of us independently, there is a mental world. Okay, but I don't want to get into too much because we'll get a bit overwhelmed. There is, so when we say that the microcosm is a representation of the macrocosm, each of these, the mental plane, the vital plane, and the physical plane, is an autonomous, independent plane, independent of us. So if we go away, it's not that the planes will go away. The plane exists on its own and they interfuse with each other. But we, being a microcosm, embody all these planes within our being. And that is the beauty of the creation, that all these are within us. And therefore, if we work upon this, just this which is inside us, we can reach the poise of the self. That's the whole part of the divine play. So what we see here are three zones called the outer, the inner, which is in the domain of nature, and the inner, which is in the domain of the Purusha. Can you see the Purusha Prakriti distinction here?
Yes.
So our normal life is spent here. And a very ill-conceived, poorly executed, unstable, stumbling, bungling conglomeration of these three principles is what we call the ego. It is bungling and stumbling because it is torn apart between these different principles which have their own principles, and it tries to impose some order but cannot do it. And that's why we are, as they say, every man is a society, right? The meaning of every man is a society, as they say in Western philosophy, is that every man is almost always pulled in different directions. And sometimes one part takes sway over the other, right? We all know this, so we don't need to get to examples. So this is where we live. And this centralizing principle which tries to manage these three is what we call the ego. So we come to the definition of the ego, which we mentioned we will come to. This is what is called the universal plane, where our mind, the subliminal, this can be called the subliminal, to use Jung, or not Freud, but Jung. Freud is here. This is Freud. Jung, the subliminal, and many other developmental psychologists dwell without being exactly clear about it on the subliminal plane, which is called the inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. This is a profoundly vast, huge, luminous plane where we, our individual monads, some of us will know this term, interfuse and interact and even identify with the monads of others. So if we develop our acuity in these planes, I can do remote viewing, I can do mind reading, I can do hypnotherapy, I can do psychokinesis, all sorts of what we call paranormal phenomena to our outer consciousness is the rule of play, the normal mode of operation in this zone. But this is still the domain of Prakriti because the movement dominates over the witness. When I reach here, I am able to step back even from not my personal movements, but the huge sweep of universal movements. And only when I reach there, I can say I have become the Manomaya Purusha, the Pranamaya Purusha, and the Annamaya Purusha. I'm using terms of the Indian spiritual lexicon, which is called the mental self or the mental soul, the vital self or the vital soul, the physical self and the physical soul. Harmonizing all these three is the psychic entity or the real soul, which we just defined as the fourth principle. So this is the domain of the Purusha, and these constitute the domain of Prakriti, which we just defined as consciousness and force of consciousness. This psychic entity is connected with the cosmic or the universal self, which is called Atman, which above goes and is connected to the Brahman, the Paramatman, or the transcendent, which is outside the scope of this picture. So this is horizontally representing it, but if you look at it like sheets, it is best conceived or understood as a concentric structure. Those of us who meditate on our chakras, for example, the chakras are apertures which are on our subtle body, not our gross body. One then can then ask what is the subtle body, but we won't go so far today. The chakras mediate the connectivity between the outer and the inner. When the chakras open through the Kundalini yoga or any other form of yoga, the individual finds himself completely blended or fused with the universal. So he basically, his ego-bound individuality dissolves and he finds himself in the universal and the cosmic consciousness, the upper reach of which is called the overmind. But let's not go there now. From the universal consciousness, when he is able to step back even from those universal movements, he reaches the poise of the mental, the vital, and the physical self. And from there, when he is able to travel even more inside, he reaches the soul. So the soul journey in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, this is the journey from ego to soul, is the first of what we can call the triple transformation process. We'll come to that later. So for this yoga, the first and inevitable step before movements up and down the vertical plane is the movement in the horizontal concentric plane to dissolve the false individuality nucleated around the ego and reclaim the true spiritual individuality nucleated around the soul.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Neelesh. Let's go to number 2. Evanik has a question. Evanik, give me just a second. Evanik, go ahead. Evanik, go ahead.
Sorry, I was having problems unmuting. My question is actually on that presentation that you just had up. And so is the top layer similar to, is the top layer similar to the divine zone? So you were saying that top layers, I guess the top layer, the mental self, the inner mind, and the outer mind, are they the same as the divine zone? I'm not sure if I got that.
Okay,
I understand that concept. Sorry.
No problem. What I'll do is I'll show you a combined diagram where the horizontal concentric and the vertical are shown together. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So this is the divine zone from a vertical standpoint. But as I said, all these planes are just shown for expediency. They are all immanent. The transcendent is immanent into manifestation. This is the zone of manifestation. So this is, from a vertical sense, this is the divine zone. The divine actually is everywhere, but from a parlance standpoint, this is the native, pure, unveiled divine zone. This is the divine veiling and concealing himself in manifest creation, where on the innermost plane, again, the divine is closer to his native purity and suzerainty and sovereignty, whereas on the right-hand side here is where we are potentially the most undivine. But even the undivine is a part of the divine because the divine is all there is. But relatively speaking, this is where the ignorance is the most acute. And this is the zone where evil and disharmony and all of these things that we normally experience in the world operate. So to move from the human ignorance to the divine knowledge, one has to move from here to here and then from here to here.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Evanik. Let's see. I'm going to ask a question about number 2. Again, folks, your questions take priority. So you made an amazing observation. You're saying that there is the consciousness, which is the witness, and there is the force, which is the dynamic. And most of us, most of the times, it's the dynamic that dominates the witness. So there is no steady point from which to even you are acting. You're just getting slapped by things coming in, random things coming in, which have nothing to do with the consciousness.
Absolutely.
And it's all about, I'd like your term, recovering the poise of that core, that witness, and moving out from there. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. In Western, if I were to, when we say loosely, that are you centered? That's what we mean. So when you're off center, you are not rooted. Your origin is unclear, or you're as if displaced from your origin. And we can use terms like float Sam or jet Sam, right? You are basically, if you're on the sea, you are just tossed around by the waves of universal nature. And when we are talking of the ignorant sides of the universal nature, has universal knowledge. It also has universal ignorance, right? So when we are in the lower hemisphere, we are more prone to ignorance than knowledge. And so we are swept. It's like being wind swept.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
So the reclamation of the center, which we stumblingly do with our ego, is some intermediate way of finding our center, but that's usually false because it is nucleated around the separativity and the ignorance. So when we say reclamation of the true center, the first step is the reclamation around the ego, because that's all there is we experience when we are living in the outer being. But as we move into the inner domains of our existence, the probability function of our being able to claim our true individuality around the soul, but not the ego, gently increases.
Wow. I'm going to jump to the fourth principle. I mean, that is a very profound and exalted view of what is possible to each of us. Isn't that true? I mean, this is really one of the most profound views that I've seen of saying what is possible to an individual. So could you talk a little bit more about what is he saying about what is possible to individuals?
Each individual, it is possible for each and every individual to achieve the full and total poise of the Brahman. As you can see, it's a very modest goal.
Mm-hmm.
So Sri Aurobindo's yoga takes what we normally call spiritual practice to its ultimacy. We are doing a course on inner and outer freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he takes this to the it is only at the poise of the self that one can be totally free. Why? Because it is only at the poise of the self where one can reclaim the true unity of all things, because the self is the one self of all things. As simple as that, but not easy. But so the reclamation of harmony, the alignment of individual and collective, and all the political and social problems in the outer life that we experience and we are constantly struggling with, are resolved. That's why I go back to that Vedanta, that profound quotation. There is one indivisible truth in which everything is reconciled, everything is harmonized, understood, both in its nature and in its end, and it stands fully explained through a process of experience, direct and self-revealed. That is the answer to your question, Srikant. That is what is possible for each one of us.
Wow. Okay, Neelesh, how about proceeding further? Go ahead.
So Sri Aurobindo's teaching, now once we understand these, so we started with the Vedanta principle, the oneself, immanent, present, inhabiting everything, yet having a poise that transcends everything, right? We then understood these four truth principles. So the core teaching of Sri Aurobindo is that this one being in consciousness, or the Brahman, is concealed and embedded in the material life which we experience. Through this septuple principle of the seven planes, gradually losing itself both in a vertically downward and a horizontally outward sense. Yes?
Yes.
Evolution, therefore, is, so this is called involution, which means this concealing and embedding and almost hiding itself. So spirit is playing hide and seek with us. The ancient, when you study the Bhagavad Gita and understand the Krishna Leela, when Krishna hides from the gopis, the significance is the divine hiding from manifest creation. And when the gopis are attracted by the divine flute and seek Sri Krishna in the forest, it is this outer nature trying to reclaim the truth of its own being.
Wow. Wow.
When Sri Krishna steals the clothes of the gopis who are bathing in the river, he is saying, let go of all your pretensions and be naked in front of me if you have to find me. So evolution is the process by which this consciousness, which is involved and embedded, liberates itself through individuated units of consciousness such as us. This consciousness stirs and flowers in what seems to be almost dead or unconscious, and is then self-impelled to widen, heighten, deepen, so as to progress towards its original native power and perfection. Life out of inert matter is the first step of the release of this consciousness. Life out of inert matter. Mind out of living matter is the next. So compare an insect, an amoeba, a plant, an animal, a human being, right? So we understand what this, so life out of inert matter and mind out of living matter is the next. But Sri Aurobindo says that the evolution does not finish with mind. It awaits a release into a greater principle and operating mode, a consciousness which is spiritual and eventually supramental. For man, such as us, who are the only truly mental being in all of terrestrial existence, and therefore the forerunner and torch bearer of the evolutionary journey, the next step of the evolution must be towards the development of supermind and spirit as the dominant power in the conscious being. And only then will the involved divinity in material existence be able to express itself entirely, totally unveiled, and therefore make it possible for terrestrial life to manifest perfection, which is what he calls the life divine.
Wow. Wow. I mean, that's what I think separates him from ascetics, where there is a tendency, there is a large body of people in India, intellectuals, who, in order to secure the core, actually disparage the word and go inside. He's not saying, he's saying something very different from that. He's saying manifest that core in the world, right?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic point you make. India has suffered from about 2 millennia of this ascetic, escapist, illusionist, stepping back, escape, hermitage in the forest, the mountain, etc., etc. And it had its own utility because, as we said, there needs to be the witness poised to step back from nature as an intermediate step to reclaim full sovereignty of nature. The soul cannot be subsumed and engulfed in nature and from there exercise its dominance. It's not possible. So he has to step back. It's in a mental world when we say in philosophy, step back. That's exactly the same principle, but in a spiritual sense, it is far more deeper. When we say step back from your thought, step back from your impulse, step back, when we say reclaim your freedom, when we discussed in another chat, it's not the freedom of what you can do, but what you need not do or can prevent yourself from doing. So that's all the stepping back movement. But in a mental sense, it can only go so far because the mind is not the supreme principle. It has limitations of integrality and reach and capacity and power. The full exercise of power into matter, which is almost completely unconscious, except with some movement of electrons orbiting around the nucleus. There is virtually no consciousness, right? Even nucleus, even proto-consciousness is a weak term. And that's where the division principle is the maximum, because your body is at the level of matter, your body is completely distinct from mind, right? At the level of emotion, we can interfuse. At the level of mental thought, we can interpenetrate because the mind, the mental plane is more fluidic. The vital plane, denser than the mental plane, but still has fluidity. At the physical level, we are almost doomed to complete separativity because matter is rigid, hard, and completely encapsulated in form. The recovery of unit in material existence without abrogating the matter principle can only be done from the highest echelon of spirit, which is the supermind. So there is a scientific reason why all of this is what it is.
Wonderful. So I want to open it up for questions very soon, within a minute or so. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to ask any question. Now, any question is fine at this point. I want to say something here, Neelesh. I think this is a fantastic introduction, and we will definitely need to do more of these to to flesh this out. We cannot cover everything, but I think we've done a fantastic job of putting at least core pieces for people to look at so they can follow up on their own. So Neelesh, if somebody wants to study this further, what would you recommend? I thought the video that you recommended was excellent. Is there any of his books that you would recommend that people start with?
The video which I sent you, which is actually it's a three-part series. I sent you the first one, which you may have published. So if you go to YouTube, there is a part 2 and a part 3. The part 2 talks about integral yoga. We have covered 2 of the 5 questions today, Shrikant.
Mm-hmm.
So the second video covers the third question, which describes the integral yoga. And the third video goes in great depth on the first truth principle and the fourth, which means all questions around planes of consciousness and parts of being are answered in the third video. And large parts of the psychic principle, which we just now discussed, are also understood in the third video. After these 3 videos, you can just go onto the internet and his 37 volumes are online. Just choose any and start. Sri Aurobindo's writing is kind of the holographic principle. You can start from any place and get to the whole place. But I would say that there are two ways you can start reading him. There are some people who find it easier to read somebody else's writing about Sri Aurobindo before getting into Sri Aurobindo proper, because it can sometimes be a bit difficult. But I say this just as a general principle, don't take this too literally. If one were to want to read somebody else's writing about Sri Aurobindo, then I would recommend a book called Sri Aurobindo and the Adventure of Consciousness by Satprem.
Mhm.
Satrem. You can find a PDF on the internet also. If you want to read Sri Aurobindo directly and you are primarily of a philosophical mindset and you want to understand the whole spiritual philosophy, the whole sweep, the panoramic sweep of his spiritual philosophy, including cosmology, cosmogony, and everything else, then I would recommend The Life Divine. If you are more practice oriented and you want to get to the principles of the integral yoga before too much of philosophy, depending on your orientation, then the best place to start to understand the components and the principles of the integral yoga is a book called The Synthesis of Yoga. If you are adventurous enough to dive into 2,400 pages across 4 volumes, which integrates both the philosophy and the practice, including the practical elements of the practice, such as the difficulties and challenges one faces, then there's a 4-volume set called Letters on Yoga. And the compilation is basically his answers to several letters of several thousands of yogis, practitioners. And the editors have done a very fantastic compilation of this into basically the full table of contents on his entire body of work across 4 volumes. So Letters on Yoga, if you look at the table of contents, that's the full panoramic view, even in ways better than The Life Divine, to not only cover the description, but the prescription as well.
Wonderful.
In other words, the full journey.
Wonderful. Neelesh, we have 20 minutes. So let me ask you the question about integral yoga, because that would kind of bring all of this discussion to a very nice close. What is integral yoga?
So if you remember the diagram, we said that one has to go in and up, and then there's a process of down and out. Outer being, outer mode of existence, to inner, to inmost. Inmost has a direct channel, a hotline, if you will, to the divine. Both divine understood in the impersonal sense and the personal sense. It's very, very important. This can almost be called the 5th principle. Sri Aurobindo's yoga, as much as it has the yoga of knowledge, which is more towards the impersonal aspect of the divine, there's an equal, if not even more, the crown is the direct communion with the personal divine as friend and lover. This is the Sri Krishna aspect of the bhakti, right? So this direct line is in both the impersonal and the personal senses. So out to in to up, that is the sadhaka's mandate. Then what the divine does, or the spiritual consciousness does, is down and out, which means the descent of the spiritual force into the nature and starting an inside-out process led by the soul to the complete transformation of the outer nature. This is the integral yoga.
Wow. Wow. Wonderful. Do you have any closing thoughts, Neelesh?
Thank you for this invitation. And if anybody, as a result of this, wishes to explore further, please feel free to connect with Shrikant. Shrikant has my coordinates.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we will do is that I definitely want to do a follow-up on this. I'm going to post the video up. I'm going to talk to people who are here. It is Neelesh, in all fairness, this is a really deep idea. And so what will happen is that it'll take people to kind of percolate on this, and they will start talking to me, and we will go ahead and do a follow-up where we can, because I'm very impressed with the crispness with which you have put the key ideas down, the key markers down. And I would like to do a follow-up in order to build up on that.
Sure.
Wonderful. All right. So thank you very much, Neelesh. Really appreciate that. And thank you very much, Yasuhiko, for introducing me to Neelesh. And folks, we are beginning, this is our beginning of journey into Indian thought. And we look forward to having you. It's going to be an amazing journey. Thank you very much, everybody. Go ahead, Neelesh.
Just one point, since you mentioned the Indian journey, from my personal experience, I had no previous familiarity with any of the Indian spiritual texts, but I find it tremendously efficient and also the most rewarding way, because Sri Aurobindo has actually provided his own commentary on all the salient Upanishads and the Vedas. So, and he has, through his own yogic journey, needless to say, distilled the best and the highest, presented it in the most compelling manner in English that is intelligible to the Western mind, through the Western philosophical, individual, rationalistic framework of thought. And so when you asked me about the Gita, if you remember, I mentioned that if one were to do the most effective and efficient way of culling the highest and the cream, the essence, the nectar of the entire body of Indian spiritual literature, in my opinion, there is no better way to reach Sri Aurobindo only, because he covers that whole journey himself, on which he builds his own supramental yoga. So,
no, wonderful. I mean, the reason I am really interested in Sri Aurobindo is that we've been working on, Yasuhiko has been doing that. We've been doing that of integrating the outer and the inner, because West is so good at the outer and relatively so inexperienced with the inner, whereas the East is so well experienced with the inner, but not as good at the outer. Here is a thinker, Sri Aurobindo, who has this immense richness of the inner. At the same time, he regards outer not as to be ignored, but to be embraced. So he's providing an integration of inner and outer. So it's very much core of what what all of us need to be doing in order to bring the East and Western thought together. So thank you very much, everybody. We will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Neelesh.